Have you ever wanted to incorporate type into one of your illustrations, whether it's for a shirt design or a poster or a book cover, and it just didn't look right? It didn't feel cohesive. It just felt like it was tacked on and didn't feel like it was part of the overall illustration? If so, I think this video might help you out. One reason why it doesn't always mesh aesthetically is that your line work is imperfect. And I don't mean that as an insult, I mean it in a good way. You've drawn with your hand, it's got that hand-done quality. Otherwise it would just be a photograph or a robot drawing. What I'm trying to get at here is the imperfection is what makes it great. We're all like little imperfect snowflakes. Raindrops. No, snowflakes. We're snowflakes. But not like, listen, you're special, you're unique. What was I talking about again? Typefaces are typically very precise, often very computery, if you will. Just very structured, very consistent. So when you try to mesh that with something that has a handmade quality, a little bit of a looseness, they don't always look great together. Listen, this doesn't mean that I'm telling you to replace your nice, clean Helvetica with the first hand-drawn typeface that you can download on the internet. Definitely don't do that. Please don't do that. Those are typically terrible. Awful. Just the worst. You can ruin a perfectly good illustration with some bad type. Just a little bit of bad type can destroy a good illustration. It's like if you made a beautiful meal. I'm not a cook, so I don't know how this analogy is gonna go. And then you decided to top it off with, let's say you're making some cookies. Instead of sugar, used salt. This isn't the right analogy because there's a main ingredient. I'm talking about, I got it. So you know those like peanut butter cookies, and then they have that like Hershey Kiss in the middle? So it's mainly about the peanut butter cookies, but then there's the Hershey Kiss. Think of the Hershey Kiss as the type that you've added to your illustration. Imagine if instead of a Hershey Kiss, you accidentally put like, I don't know, a thumbtack or a urinal cake. That's the equivalent of adding bad type to your illustrations. Okay, so one thing that you can do, if there's not a lot of type, is you can just set the type in Adobe Illustrator or Photoshop or InDesign, whatever you're using, and then take that type and then just trace over it. So that way you're getting the structure and the quality of the letters and how they're designed, but you're adding that little bit of hand, your hand, into the mix so that it matches the overall feel. It'll just soften things up a little bit and make it more cohesive. The problem is, what if there's a whole bunch of type? We're not talking about a paragraph here. I'm not talking about a paragraph. I'm not going to set a whole paragraph in handmade type. I'm just saying, what if there's a whole bunch of things? What if you have a series of things and they all need a little bit of type and you don't want to be tracing all these different things? What you can do is make a handmade version of a typeface that you can use for these applications. And I know, you're thinking, well, I don't know how to make a font. That's what this video is for. It's actually not that complicated. There's a really great plugin by FontSelf for both Illustrator and Photoshop that makes it really easy to convert your drawings into a font. I've made a bunch of different fonts this way that I use in different applications where I need to incorporate a little bit of type that I don't necessarily want to spend the time hand lettering, but I want it to have that handmade feel, but also some structure as opposed to it just looking very loose. Sometimes you want that balance of handmade with a little bit of structure. You know what I'm saying? Just a balance. I'm talking about a balance here. You don't want all the lettering to be wild. Sometimes you might have a little wild type treatment, but then you got some simple stuff. Another reason why typeface could be really helpful, let's say you're doing an illustration and you want type on an arc. Having to draw that all out can be really difficult and confusing. But if you have a handmade typeface, you can just use that type on a path tool and set your type around it, and you didn't have to do any of the work. Well, you did the work before, but you don't have to do it again. This is the gift that you can give yourself that will keep on giving. I don't know. Let's get into it. Let's head over to my computer instead of my iPad. I usually say meet you at the iPad, but today we're going to start at the computer. Okay, so the first thing that we need to do is make a template that we can mess up and make it look a little bit more handmade. So I'm going to go into Adobe Illustrator over here. I'm going to make a new file, and I'm going to set my file up 5,000 pixels by 5,000 pixels. That will be a big enough size that we will be able to have enough detail in order to make our type look handmade. So I'm going to hit create. And now what you're going to do is choose a typeface that you want to base your new handmade font off of. For me, I'm going to choose Gotham Black. That's a typeface that I use quite often for like the pop-ups in my videos. And sometimes if I need to incorporate some simple type into my illustrations that I don't want to just full on hand letter, I'll use this. It's a simple sans serif typeface that goes well in a lot of different applications. So I'm going to choose that typeface. I'm going to go into my character menu in Illustrator if you're not familiar with Illustrator. It's just like Photoshop in terms of the tools and menus. So I'll go into character and I will look for Gotham. I will grab Gotham Black. And then what I'm going to do is just go in and type out all of the characters that I need for my typeface. So that's all the letters, all the numbers, so 0 through 9, and then the special characters and punctuation. You can just look on your keyboard and find all the different things that you might need. Now, if you're just using this for your own personal use to make your life easier with illustration and you don't care about some of these other symbols that you might not use, you can go ahead and skip those. You don't have to do everything. If you want to be prepared in case you may need them someday, you could take the extra couple minutes and do them. Not that big of a deal. The key here is to get all of your letters into this document, keeping them all the same size, but taking up as much room as you can. There's no right or wrong way to do this. You just want to fill your page with all the different symbols and keep them the same size, because when we bring it back in to make the font, having them all the same size will keep the font consistent and easy to use, and that's what we want. One quick thing, when you are in Illustrator, you want to make sure that if you're sizing with the arrow or transform tool, you want to always be holding Shift, and don't let go of Shift until you let go of that mouse, because you can start stretching type, and then you're just going to make a font based off of stretched bad type. And you don't want to do that. You don't want to do that. All right, I'm going to get all my stuff here and I'll see you in a minute. Okay, I'm back. So I have my file here, which has all the different letters of this typeface and then all the numbers and all of the symbols. And you can see I'm using as much of this document as I can. The reason for that is we want the letters and symbols big enough so that we've got some pixel real estate for beating it up a little bit and making it look handmade. One quick tip that I forgot to mention before for when you're setting up your file, you want to have some decent space between each of your characters. That way, when we have to go back in and select them individually after we've messed them up a little bit, it'll be easier. If they're really close together, it'll be tedious to separate them. So an easy way to control this is in your character dialog box in Illustrator. You'll see your typeface and then the weight, and then below that you've got some different spacing setups. The two on the right are the ones that you want to use here. So the first one controls the space in between lines. So if you want extra space vertically, you just increase that number. And then the one below that is the space in between the characters. So if you need more space between the letters, which you probably do, because it's going to default pretty tight, you can bring that up. Because our file is so big and our letters are so big, the default number settings in the menus are probably not going to be applicable because your type is probably going to be like 500 points. and it's probably going to default to like 72 or 100 at the biggest. So you'll just have to type in those sizes manually. So I'm going to go ahead and export this. So I'm going to go to File, Export, and I'm going to choose Export for Screens. And then we have this first artboard selected. We can choose our location here, wherever you want to save it. It's up to you. We get the format PNG. That is fine. That is fine, I mean. And then we can go to Export Artboard. Okay, so we can close this. I'm going to go over to Photoshop. I'm going to open up this file. What we want to do is take this typeface and change it from being very crisp, precise, perfect angles, and make it look a little bit more handmade. Now, if you look through the filters on Photoshop, there are plenty of filters here that would sort of do that thing for you. The problem is, when you use them on their own, they tend to look not handmade. They look computer generated a little bit. Some of them do a decent job on their own, but if you're very particular, like me, you may notice these kind of things. And I feel like a little bit of attention to detail goes a long way. So the process here is to go through a sequence of different filters that will slowly evolve our letters into a way that looks more natural and imperfect in a way that would make sense, not in a consistent imperfect way, if that makes sense. I think I said if that makes sense like 3 times in a row. Before I go through any of those different things I'm talking about with the different filters that will make it look more handmade, the first thing that I like to do before any of that is to go into filters. It's a filter, but it's different. So we're going to go to blur and then Gaussian blur. So what I like to do here is just add a little bit of blur to soften things up. So I usually go to about 4 pixels in the radius option here. It gives a little blur to the letters. We don't want our letters to have a blur because that doesn't look natural. But what we can do now is go to Filter, Sketch, and then Stamp. And now this is going to smooth out the blur. So it's going to like find the edges of the blur, and you can sort of adjust these menus on the side, the light and dark balance and the smoothness, to sort of get to a comfortable spot. But what I'm doing here is just getting it so it's not changing the letters a lot, but it's just getting rid of that blur and softening the corners a little bit. So if we hit OK, you'll see that we've got nice black letters here, no more blur, but everything is a bit softer. There's no sharp, hard edges. So as I mentioned, the process is improvised and you're sort of going to make it up as you go, but I'm going to show you the different things that you can just sort of go back and forth through. I don't say back because you're mostly going to go forward. So there's a number of filters that you're just going to keep doing on top of each other, and they're slowly going to change things subtly. So the first one that I like to use is under Sketch in the filters, and it is Torn Edges. So what this does is it makes it look like it has torn edges. So it makes them a little bit rough. And you can see with these slider bars, you can control how much texture there is. So if we turn the texture up and you look at it, you can see what I'm talking about it not being very natural in terms of how something would tear. It's very uniform all the way around. So it doesn't look like a torn edge, because a torn edge isn't perfect, and we want something that looks like a human hand made it, not a robot hand. So what I like to do is do sort of a minimal amount of this torn edge. So I like to bring the smoothness up pretty high, and then you can adjust the contrast to like sort of break apart the letters. If you wanted some like more texture and something that looked more like printmaking, more screen printed, this would be a good way to get there. But what I'm looking for here is just letters that look like they were hand-drawn, not necessarily a printmaking technique. That's something that I might change from illustration to illustration, and I want this to be something that is more flexible, that I can use in a lot of different situations. So I'm going to avoid texture in this font that I'm going to make. So I'm going to bring the contrast back down, and I'm going to hit OK. What we've got here is we've got a texture to the edges, which is pretty good. But again, it's too consistent. So now, if we run it through another filter, that filter is going to take into account this filter, which is a little bit imperfect, and it's going to make it imperfect based on this imperfectness, which will give us 2 levels of slight imperfectness, which will get us closer to human touch. So another one that I like to mess with is the Conti crayon. So there's some different options here. For the texture, you can base it in sandstone, canvas, burlap. You can do whatever you want to do. So I'm going to do the sandstone. It's a little more subtle. And then there's like this relief thing at the bottom, which shows how much texture there is. I like to avoid getting too much texture in the background because that's going to make it really hard to separate our letters from that. So keep that in mind. And then you can control the size of the scaling. So I'm going to find like a middle ground to that scaling. I'm going to pull the relief down so that we're not getting a lot of stuff in the background. And then let's see, the foreground level, can pull that up a little bit. So we're getting some grit in the background, but that's okay because we can get rid of that in some of the next steps. So I'm going to hit OK. Now we're getting somewhere. As you can see, through the combination, it's getting less perfect. So now what I like to do is go back in to the stamp. So under Sketch, Stamp. And I think of the stamp as sort of like a reset. So it's like getting our new base from where we are. We can bring the light-dark balance down to get us closer to where it was. Then you can sort of control the smoothness a little bit. I want to keep the smoothness pretty low. Just enough to get rid of the spots in the background is what I want to do there. So we hit OK. So now if you zoom in and look at these letters, they have some texture to them that looks a little handmade, but it's not a perfect texture like when we first applied that first filter, which I think was the torn edges, where it was just exactly the same texture all the way around. So if we look here, like for example, this W, it comes in a little bit, goes down, and then there's like a bigger chunk there, and then like little ones. So it's a more natural line. So, you know, I could be pretty happy with this. This is pretty good. But I think I'm going to go through a couple more of these steps to get it to maybe a place I like. And maybe I'll decide this was good enough. What you're going to do is just go through a sequence, and there's no right or wrong sequence of doing it. You don't have to do it in a particular order. You're just sort of going back and forth between these filters, and I found that these are sort of the best ones for this kind of thing. You can also try the filter under Sketch called reticulation. This can sort of mess up the edges a little bit more if you want. This sort of adds a lot of texture in. Sometimes I don't remember exactly what these sliders do, but it's sort of just playing around. So this sort of can give you an interesting edge, but when you use this, you end up having to definitely go into the stamp afterwards. Like if you get it to this point and you sort of like the texture, but it's a little too gray, what you can do is hit OK here. And then you can go to Image Adjustments, Levels, and then just sort of pull the black slider all the way over to get that sort of pure black. And then you can pull the white over to get rid of the stuff on the outside. And you can see you're getting a nice pattern into the letters that looks sort of like a stamp printing effect. So if that's something you wanted, you could do that. But I don't want that for this, as I mentioned. So I'm going to slide these over a little bit so there's more weight on the black side to get rid of the sort of spots inside the letters. I'm going to do the stamp one more time to get rid of this sort of grit in the background. So Sketch, stamp, we are pretty good here. So I'm pretty happy with this. You can see there's a few little dots, but we can ignore those. We don't need to worry about that. If you're not satisfied yet, you can keep going. You can go through the sequence as many times as you want. And when I say sequence, it's a made-up sequence because you can start with reticulation and then go to torn edges and then stamp and then Conti crayon. I recommend through all of the sequences to sort of end with a stamp though. The stamp gets you closer to what it's going to look like when we bring it back into Illustrator and convert it into vector artwork, which I haven't really mentioned yet, but typefaces are vector. So we're going to need to take this artwork and make it into vector artwork so that it can work as a typeface. The reason it needs to be vector is because vector is not based in pixels. It's based in sort of like mathematical equations. And the reason that's important is because type needs to be able to be used really small and really big. And if it was pixel based, when it got really big, it would start to get pixelated. So you don't want that. You can't have that. Nobody can have that. So we're going to make vector artwork. So as I was saying, the stamp function gets it to look closer, makes it pure black and white, and gets it closer to showing what we'll be able to get when we convert it to vector, because you can't have a crazy amount of detail in texture in vector artwork. You can have some, but you can't have the same that you would be able to in pixel artwork. All right, so let's save this file. I'm going to do save as so that we still have this template in case we want to try it again. All right, let's go back to Illustrator. Okay, so I'm back in Adobe Illustrator and I have my file open. Each and every one of my animals is being annoying right now. My cat could not deal with the door being shut. One of my dogs, Abby, walking down the hallway, snorting, sniffing. And no respect for my YouTube channel in this household. What we need to do now is convert this into vector artwork. We want to use the image trace tool. So what you want to do is go into Windows on the top and then choose image trace. So I have my image trace dialog box open here. The reason for this, as opposed to just clicking the image trace thing that you might have at the top of your menu, is this is going to give us a little bit more control so we can allow more texture. So I want to make sure that my image is selected. And here I'm going to click on the preview at the bottom. You may notice that your letters got really soft, a little bit too smooth, and that's not what we want. So we're going to go into these settings and try to bring back a little bit of that life to it. You'll see this arrow for advanced, so we can get some more options there. And then the first thing you'll see is threshold. So you can try just messing with this. So you just sort of pull this slider. It's still a little too smooth. And the reason for that is because we don't have enough paths or corners. If we drag the paths option all the way up, if you pull it up to 100, you'll see it's looking pretty rough. It's even rougher than what we started with. And that's because it's adding more paths than necessary. So what you can do is sort of pull this back a little bit at a time and get it to a place that feels right. You want to bring these down as low to the left as you can without messing up the artwork. So you want to get it to look the way you want it to with as minimal paths or corners as necessary. The reason for that is it just adds more complexity and makes file size bigger, makes it a little bit more annoying to use. So the less paths, the better. That's always the rule in vector artwork. So this looks fine to me. So what I'm going to do now is just go up to the top here and hit this expand button. And this made it into vector artwork. If you want to see, you could do Command Y, and this will just show us the outlines. And you'll see all these little points that are making up our letters. So the next step is to go to Object. You want to make sure everything is still selected. If you're not sure, you can just do Command A, and then go to Object, Ungroup. So what this is going to do is allow us to select each thing individually. So what I like to do now is to separate things into different layers. I'm going to grab my layers window. If you don't have a layers window open, you can get it under a window, choose layers. And I'm going to hit the plus at the bottom, make a new layer. And I'm going to name this layer A through Z. So what I'm going to do is come down here and select, you guessed it, A through Z. So when they're selected, you'll see this little blue dot on your layers menu over to the right, and I'm just going to drag that up. And now it's on its own layer. I'm actually going to turn that layer off so that it's easier to focus on the stuff that we have to sort. So I'm going to make a new layer. I'm going to name this one 0 through 9. And I'm going to go ahead and select 0 through 9. I'm going to drag that up there, turn that off, and now we've got all this other stuff, which is fine and dandy. We can leave this here. But what I like to do is, because this is all ungrouped, I want to group the things that belong to each other, like the different elements of the percentage sign. So when I say group, I actually want to combine them. So I want to do that using the Pathfinder tool. So if you don't have the Pathfinder tool, you can get it under Windows, just like everything else. So what this Pathfinder tool does is it allows us to combine the shapes. So I'm going to go over to the percentage tool, select the 3 elements. So I'm just clicking and dragging and selecting, and then hitting this first one, and that makes it one shape. So now when I click on any part of that, it selects the whole thing. So this equal sign will do the same thing. Combine that. We can do it with these quotes, these as well, and then the colon and semicolon. Okay, so now we are going to use this magical Font Self Illustrator plugin. If you didn't install it yet, or you didn't get it, go do that. The installation process is super simple. You download it, and then you just click, and it'll do it for you, and it'll be all set. So after you install it, after it installs itself for you, you're just going to go up to Window, Extensions, and then choose Font Self Maker. And you'll see this window pop up. This is what we're going to use to assign our letters to be actual letters. So to start making your font, we need to drag and drop our letters here. What we need to do though is put all of our letters in a single line, because that's the way this will read it and auto-interpret everything like that. So what I'm going to do is go to my layer that has A through Z on it, and I'm just going to move this up in my artboard, move it over to the edge, and then drag this up like that, and then move the Z up like that. So if you are concerned that maybe the baselines aren't correct, you can select all of them and then use your Align tool, which if you don't have it open, if you go to Window, choose Align, and then we can click this one over here on the right, and that'll put them on a line. You may choose to subtly change the baseline if you want it to be a little bit more imperfect. I'm not going to do that here because it's going to be different for every letter combination, so I'm not that worried about that. All right, so now that these are all in a line, we can select them all, and we can go ahead and just drag those here to A through Z. And just like that, look at that. We got all our letters. They're the typeface already. It's amazing. As you can see, there's uppercase and lowercase, so if you did lowercase as well, you would drag those to the lowercase one. I'm just going to use it for both uppercase and lowercase, just in case I forget to do caps lock. Or I guess I could have just skipped the uppercase. The next step we want to do is go ahead and get our numbers. So I'm going to click on that layer, and then I'm going to put these in a single line. I'll use my Align tool to keep them straight. And we can select all of that, and we can go ahead and just click the 0 through 9 on our Font Self window, and that'll automatically pull these in. And as you can see, they're assigned to their respective numbers, just like magic. Okay, so now I'm going to move on to our other stuff, like the punctuation and symbols and stuff like that. So we'll do the same thing we did before. Put these all on a line in sequence. So I'm not going to want to use the Align tool for these because some stuff is up high, some stuff is low, some stuff is in the middle. So I'm just going to sort of eyeball it and make sure it's close. And again, this is supposed to be a handmade typeface. So I don't want it to be perfect. And also, some of this stuff is down low because of how we placed it in our file when we were trying to spread things out. So we can always adjust it after the fact. So I'm realizing that we have some stuff that is stacked here. So I'm just going to make sure that they have their own space, like these commas, quotes, periods. So I'm going to shift this stuff over. So it says things are on multiple lines. I don't really think that's the case, so we can just hit import anyway. So now you'll see we've got all of these different symbols here. So what we need to do now is just go in and assign them what they are. So for example, we'll click on this first one, and then you just go to your keyboard, shift and squiggly line, and now that is for your squiggly line. So I'm just going to go through all of these and name them. You'll see there's some of these blank ones, and it seems like maybe there were some extra little points. Oh, now that I'm selected, I can see here that there were some little pixels, little points that were made from pixels from when we were distressing it, and there was some extra black spots. We don't need to worry about those things. So what you can do if this happens to you is just go in and hit the trash. Okay, so I'm going to delete all the extra stuff I don't need and then assign the characters to their specific thing, key or key sequence. Okay, so I have everything inputted and named. What you might have to do is go in and sort of adjust the height a little bit or where things sit. So for example, things like dashes, you want those to be in the middle of the letter. So if we go down here to our end dash, we can shift that up a little bit and move it. If you're not sure on where it's sitting, you can see it up here in your preview window. So if I shift that up, I can look and see that it's up really high. I want that to be in the middle. So I'm going to move that down and you can see that it's in the middle there. Everything else looks like it's pretty good. I want to lower my @ sign a little bit actually. So I'm going to go and grab that, shift that a little bit. So that looks good visually. All my other punctuation looks good. I'm noticing that there's some little spacing issues here. We can go ahead and hit Smart. And what this will do is it'll automatically sort of space out our letters and adjust things pretty perfectly. So if you click on Advanced next to the Smart option, which we use to sort of get everything set up, this will let you fine tune if you wanted to adjust spacing here. And you can type in whatever you want here to sort of see how it would look. So let's say if we go over to the A, and then, so the spacing on the left is defaulted to -6. Let's say we wanted to change that. Let's just change it to 50 to be crazy, so I can show you what it looks like. We hit 50, and you can see that there's a big space in front of all of the A's in our document. So that's not what we want. Let's go back to the -6 option, type in -6, and you can see the spacing makes more sense. So I noticed that the 0 and the 1 were like on top of each other here. And I thought the 0 was the issue, but when I see a whole bunch of zeros, they look fine. So it tells me that the 1 is likely the issue. So let's go over to our 1, and you'll see that it, for some reason, changed it to -155, which we don't want. We probably want something negative. So let's do -50 and see if that solves our problem. So that's better. It's still a little too tight. So let's go to -25. So that looks consistent with the rest of the letters. So you can kind of go in and change this as much as you want. Although I think this did a pretty good job, I don't like how tight the letters are to each other. So I can go over here above this text thing and see the letter space, and I can just sort of keep hitting plus until I get this to a point that I feel good about. So I like that better. And I also want to tighten the space between the lines. So I can go ahead and just decrease that into a point that I'm happy with. So I think this looks pretty good. This isn't a typeface that I would be setting paragraphs in. I'd be more of doing it as a sort of like bigger text in a line. So having the line spacing a little tighter will make more sense for the applications that I'm going to use it in. You'll also notice here if there's some like special characters that you didn't make, like the E with the accent over it. I decided to not make that kind of thing because I don't really need to use that in my work. But if it's something that makes sense for you, you would want to make those characters, but you probably already knew that when you went into this. So if you had something that you wanted to add in, you could make anything you want here. Like you're not limited to anything. You don't have to follow any rules. If there's some sort of symbol here that you don't use and you want to make something else, you could hide some little secret Easter eggs in here for demonstration purposes. Okay, so now we got this little face thing. All I want to do now is just make sure that it's like relatively close to the size of our other letters. And it looks like it's a bit big, so I'm going to shrink this down a little bit. That looks like it's about right. So now I have that selected. I can go up here where it says type any character. So let's say we want this to appear for option 0. So I'm gonna hold option O, not 0. We've got that. We've got this selected. Now I'm gonna hit create glyph. We got a little face in there. Put anything you want in your font. It's your font. Live your life. So we can go ahead, go into that folder. You'll see your font here. Hit spacebar and preview it. That's pretty cool. If you're on a Mac, it's as simple as just double clicking on it and then hitting install font. And then it's ready to go. You can use it in wherever you want. You can even use it on your iPad if you're working in Fresco or whatever other apps, Procreate you're using on there. You would just install your font and then go and find it in this folder if you're using it in the cloud or something. Or you could send it to your iPad, save it in your files. Now you have the ability to make fonts whenever you want. You could do anything. You could just have little illustrations for all the letters. You don't have to even, you can do anything you want. Anything you want. You want to have a whole alphabet of butts? You can do that. All right, was this too much font talk? You want to do some lettering? Check out this other video, which will help you get started with lettering without even having to come up with your own lettering. Good talk.